And now, the 5th season premiere of the most listened to and downloaded siblings podcast about theme parks that drops on a Thursday morning from the state of New York on that magical place we call Long Island. Theme Park Thursday with Dillo's Diz, brought to you by DillosDizResort.com. Now is the time.
Forever?
Miss Tomorrow.
Old.
A minute and a half.
Hashtag always MGM.
Step out to your right.
Old.
The secret staircase.
We always do that.
You are approaching the unloading area.
Behold the majesty of the Sistine Seal.
For the kids.
A salute to all theme parks, but mostly Walt Disney World.
What a cute ending.
Aloha and welcome aboard.
This is Theme Park Thursday with Dillo's Diz. She is Jen.
Hello.
And I am Frank, and it is the season 5 premiere.
That's crazy.
Crazy that we're on the 5th season. And if you know, we bring in the big guests for the season 5 premiere. But this one in particular, a little bit special to Jen.
Yes, very.
2 years ago, we had this guest on, and there was a tropical storm that roared. I can't say roared with my upstate New York allergies this morning through Long Island, knocking out Jen's electricity. Justin Monorail from the Passholder Lounge podcast jumped in last minute to join me as we spoke to today's guest. So Jen, finally, you are here with our guest.
I'm so excited. Finally, I was so bummed last time. The one time, I think that might be the only time I haven't been able to record because of that. And
yeah, I think we had one other recording and you were inside your car.
Yes. Yeah, I think I did. That was within that same week too, because it was all happening. And I'm like, well, if I go over here and hold my phone out the window, I can kind of do it. So
as you and I do when it comes to this subject, we have to keep it cool with our excitement because this is the whole realm here is very special to us. Our guest is the president of the Jim Henson Legacy. He is the author of the Muppets Character Encyclopedia, which always sits on my desk, and I love it so much. And now he has a new release dropping later this month, which he talked about starting in the early stages of the last time he was a guest. It's Sam and Friends, the story of Jim Henson's first television show. Please welcome back to Theme Park Thursday, Craig Shemin. Craig, hello.
Hello. Thank you. It's great to be back. And it's great to be here for the first time with Jen.
Yes.
I'm sorry that we missed each other.
I know, me too. But I'm so happy to get to chat with you today.
Me too.
You allowed us a little sneak peek at the book. And the past 2 days, I've just been excited because this is my wheelhouse. It's early television days. It's Muppets. It's all these things that I love so much and really thrills my geek brain, as it were. So we obviously want to talk about the book, but for those who don't know, please tell us about Sam and Friends and what it means in Henson history.
Well, Sam and Friends is the first show that Jim had himself. He started on early television, appearing on some other shows like Afternoon, which was part of it was a home show that the TV station WRC had. And they would make guest appearances, and Jim also did puppets on the Circle 4 Ranch, which was like the cowboy show for kids. But Sam and Friends was a nightly 5-minute show that was just Muppets at the beginning, and then they forced a human in there, and then it went back to just being Muppets. And it was basically 5 minutes. Sometimes it was on twice a night. And sometimes it was on not only in Washington, D.C., but in Baltimore when they added a sponsor that was out of Baltimore. But they could do pretty much whatever they wanted, that was suitable for family audiences, of course. And but primarily when it started, it was lip sync performances, puppet performances to music. They would use either popular songs of the day or standards or novelty records or comedy spoken word things. There was a wide range. And then eventually, as Jim Henson got more comfortable using his voice, and we talk about it in the book and the whole process that happened, they started doing intros to the records to make sure they were the proper time. And they started doing commercials in Jim's voice. They started doing full comedy sketches. And it really is the sort of comedic forefather to a lot of what came later with the Muppets, because it was that sort of same length with the commercial. You know, it was, we say 5 minutes, but it was really more like 4.5. So the Muppet content was roughly 3 minutes or so. And that was, you know, what you'd see on a Muppet Show sketch or a Sesame Street sketch. So a lot of that form grew out of what Sam and Friends was.
The first thing that really jumped out, the phrase that jumped out of the book was you call it unfiltered art. It's Jim Henson's unfiltered art. And it really took me back, and I got to think about, like, you know, the pure form of Jim Henson's art and what that was, because here we are all these years later and you see, you know, the trajectory and everything else. If you were to kind of elaborate on Jim Henson's unfiltered art and the, you know, the pure form of it, how would you describe it?
Well, it's interesting because, you know, I started working at the Henson Company when Jim was still alive. And what I saw then was a guy who was brilliant, but who had so many collaborators. And, you know, so you would see sort of the distillation of Jim's creativity through people who would design the characters and write and direct when he wasn't directing and perform. So it was still Jim Henson's work. But when you go back to Sam and Friends, you're seeing literally his fingerprints on things. He made the scenery, and later on Bob Payne worked with him on that. And he was the primary creator and visionary. He built the puppets, and then, you know, I learned in the process of doing this book that Jane Henson also built puppets. She always downplayed her participation, but Jane was the only one for a lot of this time who was working on Sam and Friends with Jim. And then eventually Bob Payne and Jerry Jewell came in. So you're seeing, you know, Jim Henson not only perform, but you're seeing him perform a puppet that he has designed in front of a backdrop that he has built. So it's Jim Henson. You're seeing, you know, what he did. And, you know, I'm not, you know, downplaying the work that came later, because right. Jim, you know, what he did over time is he surrounded himself with great collaborators who had, if not a similar vision, but they were tied into the vision that Jim had. So he was certainly in full control creatively of what came later, but it's just fun to see the purity of what Jim was doing in Sam and Friends. And the only sad thing is that you don't get to see a lot of it because so few episodes exist.
Right.
Yeah. I think it's interesting too that, you know, sometimes when you think of puppets, you think of like, oh, kids love puppets and puppet shows. And he wasn't that kid. He wasn't playing with puppets and doing all of that. So then to see this, and especially with Sam and Friends, just to see it all coming to life and all of his ideas being put out there and then adding to it and collaborating. It's so cool to see the snowball and the growth of it all over time.
And for many years, we didn't really understand what that was, because all we knew that here are the kinescopes that survive, and we occasionally discover another one. And there were boxes of acetate recordings, which are these metal discs covered with a lacquer, that they would record the music that they were going to do on that day's show, because sometimes it'd have to be edited, and these lacquer discs are what they played the music from in the control room. So Jane kept boxes of those in her garage for many years. So we had that, but all it had on it were, for the most part, just recordings of existing music. So it really didn't help us that much. And then a few years ago, Karen Falk and her team in the Jim Henson archives found 45 reel-to-reel tapes. And these had more than 400 episodes of Sam and Friends, just the audio. So when you listen to those, you can sort of track the development of the show, because he started recording those on the same day that they incorporated the company, Muppets Incorporated. It was, you know, almost you could see Jim saying, well, now we're doing a serious business, so I'm going to start recording these shows. And that's when you can really see it wasn't a complete record, because he would only record it if it was something new. As time goes on, if it, he wouldn't record. He started in the very beginning being very meticulous, and he would lean into the microphone, the tape recorder, and you'd hear March 2nd. And, and then after a few reels, that went away. And I'm like, oh, Jim, what did you do? It's so much harder to keep track now. But those tapes were amazing. And that's really what made the book possible.
Yeah.
Well, and that's why I love the book, growing up in the 80s. There was such a big buzz when the Honeymooners Lost episodes came out. So, that's what I was surrounded by as a kid. And then I got very into your show of shows in the late 90s. So anytime you hear about, and I still wait for new material from, from Sid Caesar. I'm like, when are we going to get the next thing? So I'm sure.
Well, it's funny because the Henson archivist, Karen Falk, and her associate, Susie, and Heather Henson and I took a trip down to WRC, the TV station down in Washington. And we, I was secretly hoping, that they took us, on a great tour, and they took us to the basement. I'm hoping that we'll find a closet just filled with kinescopes. But alas, they have like a plaque in the corner of the studio where they did Sam and Friends that lists all the different, because it's the same studio where they did Meet the Press in the beginning, and a bunch of it's the studio where they did it was the Kennedy Nixon debate. One of them was held there. Oh, wow. So, and of course, on the bottom was that, and of course, this was the first home of the Muppets. And but we did not find the hidden, the holy grail of the Muppets in a basement in Washington. We were hoping.
Sorry, you didn't say at any point, I have this jackhammer. If we can just get through the basement here, I'm sure that.
No, it's really interesting because we worked with a guy down there who was the assistant news director, and he was happy to show us around. But, I was like, well, Jane used to say that they would log the songs they would play because they would keep track, and it was they would keep track of the same way that they would play it on a radio station. Do you have those logs? No. It's like they got nothing. Nothing exists. So they were very helpful. It was amazing to see because with the exception of the television equipment, which of course has been modernized, the studio itself hasn't really changed much. And you can look at pictures of them performing, and you can still see the same racks of cables up in the rafters. And it was when Jim and Jane were working there, it was a brand new studio, and that when we were there, they were just getting ready to move the network to a different location. I think it's still used for WRC local, but the NBC News Bureau moved to downtown DC, I think. But yeah.
That's really cool. Again, just like even visiting those locations and knowing the history of that is very cool to me. What really took me by surprise in the book is, and you hinted at it earlier, is like kind of running parallel to the Sam and Friends story is the Jim and Jane Henson story. And so I guess I was surprised about the content for that, and I think about what I've read and what I've, researched in the past, articles, interviews, what have you, just to learn more. But I felt like seeing it all in one place like that, I'm like, did I know any of this? It all felt very new and fresh. And I really loved that parallel storytelling about that. So as you hinted that, you were surprised by her creation of the puppets. Did pooling all that together and seeing the story, like where does that take your creative brain?
It was, it was very interesting because it seemed like Jim was sort of not just in the creative driver's seat with the show, but also with that relationship because, I knew Jane for quite a few years because, when I started as an intern at Henson, that's when I met her, and she was very nice to give me advice, and she knew that I had an interest in the history. So she would tell me some stories here and there. And then a few years before she passed away, it was when they were doing the Jim Henson biography, and she was being interviewed occasionally by Brian J. Jones. And I wanted to do something book-wise. I wasn't sure what it was, and I asked Jane if I could do a few interviews with her because we were planning to do a Jim Henson legacy project, some sort of book. And so we sat down for several sessions in our conference room at the Carriage House, the Henson Carriage House in New York. And, when I listen to the recordings now, it's kind of fun because Jane fidgets a little bit. We had just had lunch and she would like crumple the wrappers. But it's a period of time that she loved to talk about because she was really involved in the project in that time, and the Muppets and Sam and Friends. But she also didn't want to take more credit than she thought she deserved, and she didn't think she deserved much credit at all. She would categorize her role as helping. It was Jim's project. I just helped.
Right.
And part of that was because she had a different plan. She was planning to become an art teacher, and she had to really choose at one point. We go into it in the book that it was, she came to a crossroads, and sort of Jim, asked her to keep working, because it was clear that he felt that he needed her as part of the team. And as the story goes on, and when they incorporated, she was a 40% owner in the corporation. That's not a helper. That's a partner.
Yeah.
And the more I talked to Jane, she would sort of begrudgingly admit that she built some of the puppets. And, oh yeah, but at the same time, she would say, but it would be silly to say that I had a major role. I was just helping. It was Jim's vision, and that sort of goes along with the whole romantic part of their life. That Jim came back, and it was sort of like a decision that was entwined in the decision for him to continue doing the Muppets as a career. He came back from his trip to Europe while Jane was keeping the show going with Bob Payne, and that's a very important part of the story. If Jane did not keep the show going, there wouldn't be a show for Jim to come back to. So Jim decided in Europe that this is what I want to do. He saw puppet performances in Europe and thought, okay, well, maybe in America it's seen as something for kids, but in Europe it's not. Maybe I can make that change in America. And he came back and said, yeah, we're going to do the puppets, and you and I are going to get married. And that was basically, Jane used to say frequently, it wasn't love at first sight when she first saw Jim in college. It was admiration at first sight. They were both seeing other people. But everyone, Jane thought, she told me that she thinks everyone else around them saw that Jim and Jane would eventually get together. Even before they saw it. And it's an interesting part of the story, and I don't go into what happened later, because their relationship had a lot of twists and turns, and but at the same time they never got divorced. They had been separated at times, but in the earliest years, it was they spent all the time together working, and it sort of grew into this relationship, and they started having kids right away. And that's why my interviews with Jane went beyond the Sam and Friends era, but she really wasn't as tied in to the Muppets after that period, because she was at home raising kids while Jim was building the company. But it was a very fascinating part of the story, because it was not a typical romance. Right. It was sort of like part of this plan that Jim had, and it seemed to make sense to everybody before it made sense to Jane.
Well, and I think it's such a big part of the foundation of everything, because you have two creative types. And even though she kind of took a back seat, you see that, at times she pushed him along a little bit, or was like, here's this, or I'll make this, or this is how it's going to go. But still took that back seat and still kind of went along with his ideas at times and all of that. But the partnership of two creative people was really interesting in those beginning stages.
Yeah. And what's, at that period, Jane got, Jane was equally credited on a lot of the articles and clippings. It was, always referred to as Jim and Jane, Jim Henson and Jane Nebel and their Muppets. And, the thing that people may not realize was that there was an age difference, that Jane was a senior when Jim was a freshman, and Jim came in, and that's when they met in puppetry class. She was a senior taking a required class for art education, and Jim was a freshman who had already done puppets on television, and he said, well, let's see, what can I learn in this puppetry class? And he ended up almost practically teaching the puppetry class because he had more experience.
Right. That's another big aspect of the book that really jumped out to me was Jim going to the class, and then kind of the first, I guess, inclinations of Jim as a leader, and just his approach as a leader. And, I mean, we see how he was publicly, but I think you could speak a little bit to Jim Henson as a leader, like, and how that transcended through the company over time.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of the same methods and because Jim led because he was really good. And he showed people what to do. He didn't command them necessarily. It was, I think it was either Jerry Jewell or someone described Jim as having a whim of steel. And it was a situation where, people sort of followed Jim because, he was creatively brilliant, and he was not an intimidating leader. He didn't lead through power, though he certainly had the authority. People, just sort of gravitated towards him and knew what he was doing was the way to go, and sort of followed that. And that's how he ended up sort of becoming, a very strong leader in that puppetry class. I think it helped because the teacher of that class was not necessarily well versed in puppetry. I met him years later, and he was very proud to have, been the teacher of that class. But he would always say that, oh, Jim was pretty well versed when he came in.
Yeah, you mentioned the conversation you overheard at in Walt Disney World of do you do this character? No. Do you do that character? No. Well, what do you? Well, everything that you've seen and loved is basically
that's and that was seeing Jim interact with fans at Disney World was really quite special. It was, I started imagining it. I guess this is kind of like what it would have been like to see Walt Disney around Disney World, because, I would see him walk around and people would just follow Jim, and he was just, even if he was just trying to go to the bathroom at the Grand Floridian, there would be like a group of people. It's like, oh, I'm going to follow Jim Henson because I don't know, he must be doing something wonderful. But yeah, it was, but that story really keyed into the whole, the Salmon Friends being the time when Jim did do everything.
Yeah. I think, and in the book, it's split into two parts, and the second half goes into a lot of the episodes. And if you read about the episodes and the descriptions and the characters, even if the characters aren't familiar to you today, you can completely relate to them of who you know now, where you can read some and go, oh, this totally turned into this character, or this background is now this character's background. And it's so interesting. It's more of the growth and what it turned into and how it all became the Muppets we know and love today.
Yeah. And, I don't know how conscious Jim was of what he was doing in terms of creating the different range of characters that were in Salmon Friends. But, later on when I was writing for the Muppets and when I deal with Muppet stuff currently, I think about it as in this way, that if you take all of the Muppet characters' traits and qualities and add them together, it equals one normal person. And the Muppets are essentially that sort of, it's just a split personality from that. And I think if you look at those Sam and Friends characters, a lot of that is the same. You have the science nature of Professor Radcliffe, and sort of the lovability. There's Yorick has the hunger that Animal has. So yeah, it laid a lot of the groundwork. And some of that also may have come from Jim's inspirations. He was a guy who loved Disney. He loved the Pogo comic strip. We reprint of lyrics to one of the Pogo songs and one of the scripts in the book. But it's funny, the sad thing in the episode guide is that we don't know visually what was going on some of these things. I try to describe the history of the different songs because, I think that people who love novelty music and mid-century music are going to love this, even if they don't know anything about the Muppets, because we try and go into history and descriptions of the various songs to try and paint something of a picture. But I sat with Jane and we listened to some of the music, and I was trying to get her to remember what was going on visually, and she really didn't. She would say, "Oh, I think there was a bird in this one," but you got to look back, and it's a 3-minute routine from 60 years ago,
right?
So and they would do them 2 a day, and they would do it on some occasions. So when they would finish, you'd move on to the next one. And Jim would just sort of, there weren't any written records beyond the song lists in terms of what was happening with the music. And so Jim, we had scripts if it was a sketch, but if it was a music performance, Jim didn't write any sort of routining down. And say, "Oh, bird moves over left," Sam goes here, that would have been very helpful if Jim had done that. So I feel bad that the episode guide can, when we have a sketch and a script to deal with, we can, imagine what was happening. But a lot of times you just sort of have to, it gives the reader an opportunity to come up with their own concept.
That kind of, I didn't know if I was going to ask this question or not, but when you listen to the audio and you were trying to get the visuals, do you see, well, it'd be cool if they tried to recreate something listening to this audio and do a lip sync? Or is it because you're never going to know what the original visual was, so it's best to leave things as an audio and that's it?
Yeah, I think I'm sort of split. And I think that the Puppet Up show that Brian Henson produces, they usually have a couple of Henson recreations as part of their performance. But most of the time they're going with something that there's film of, that it's either or tape. They're redoing a Sullivan appearance or a Sam and Friends that survives, and they've done I've Grown Accustomed to Your Face, and they've done Java and things that they know visually. And I think that I think it could be done, but it would, you can't really present it as Sam and Friends, sort of like, here's a song that Jim did and we're going to do our interpretation of it. And I think I think that that's the way to go on it. But at the same time, what's interesting is when I was listening to some of the sketches, and you listening to a few times and you can tell, oh, I get it now. Yorick is coming in and doing this, or, those you can, you can deduce some stuff over a period of time of what's happening.
I maybe this is a little bit corny, but there's a part of me that kind of loves that there's only a little bit, and there's only a little bit of the audio, so that you use your imagination, because I think that's just so much of Jim Henson, and you see his imagination come to life. And so to sit there and have to try to picture it yourself and see how it played out in your mind, it's an interesting way to storytell years later, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that once they get into doing those comedy sketches, it's it's a different experience. You're sort of listening to a radio show or a comedy record. And all of those recordings are owned by the Henson Company and Henson family. So it would be great to do something with them, so people could listen to them and maybe present them in a way with the songs that they introduce, sort of have a nice little music album, although it's hard to release those nowadays. There's not as much of a market for the things we used to call CDs.
Maybe you can turn it into a podcast. There you
go. Just review the songs.
The
other element I really love about the book is the way you don't think about it until you read the book and go, wow, this really encapsulates a history of puppeteering on television in the early days, and then elevating puppeteering on television, even just the talk of moving the monitor, like when you write, it's the first time a puppeteer could see what he's doing in a live performance, and you're like, oh like it kind of blows your mind there. So I really enjoyed that aspect of it too.
And for many of the puppeteers who were working in television early, they had come from puppet theater, where they didn't worry about looking at their performance, so they didn't really use the monitor as a tool. Some of them used it to refer to him, and if you Bert Hillstrom, who was probably the most notable puppeteer of that period, who did Kukla, Fran, and Ollie, and Burr had a very unique way of performing. He had a translucent scrim in front of his face, essentially, and he would be behind there, and he would perform the puppets out in front of the scrim, and he could see through the scrim to see how the puppets were performing. If the scrim was lit in a certain way, it would light the puppets, but it would allow him to see through the back without anybody seeing him. And that's the way he basically did it for years and years. And he had a monitor that he could look out to off to the side from time to time, but he was spending most of the time looking straight ahead through the scrim. If you watch, you can probably dial it up on YouTube, but years later, in the late 70s or early 80s, Burr Tillstrom brought Kukla and Ollie, and they were panelists on The Match Game with Gene Rayburn. And they sat in the first position, and you could see that there was this little blue scrim set up right in back of where the puppets were. And the end of the week, Burr just flipped the scrim up to take a bow, so you can see, oh, that's how it worked, because he really just had the puppets directly in front of him. So it wasn't, I think the fact that Jim didn't have any puppetry experience before helped him develop that monitor technique, which, as you said, went from we can just see ourselves to make sure we're on the air, and eventually they developed it to be a performance tool that's still being used today, the same techniques. I should give credit to my wife, Stephanie, who's a puppeteer, who helped me phrase a lot of the stuff in that chapter, because she was intimately familiar with our technique.
Helps you with the terminology.
Exactly.
Yes.
And the other part of it too is the connections that you could create from puppet to puppet, because to me, I know that I never really thought about the anarchy portion of the Muppets as like what I love about the Muppets. It just was something that was always there. But to me, it was always the connection between the characters and how deep the relationship seemed to be. And that's always what I've kind of hung my hat on. The forward is by Frank Oz. I was such a Bert and Ernie guy. I think if Frank Oz spoke to me directly, I would just be crying the whole time. But but that's where
you might be, but for different reasons.
But that's where I started with Bert and Ernie. So and then just to see how the characters connected over time, it was always there for me. So to read that part of it in terms of the history of television and the use of puppets was so fascinating.
Yeah, and you mentioned Frank, and I do want to thank him, because I'm sure he's listening. I'm sure he's a long time listener.
Obviously, he listens every week. We get a lot of letters from him. Actually,
he's like, I can't come on because I know Frank would be crying the whole time.
But Frank was so kind to write the forward, and when I sent him an email to ask him to do that, I sort of anticipated it would be a very hard sell, so I wrote sort of a dialogue of how I anticipated our conversation would go over a series of emails. So I sent that to Frank, and he, I think it was less than 2 hours later, I got an email back from him saying yes. And then he went through my whole dialogue and just kept going. It's like, I said yes already. Will you leave me alone? So he finished the forward way before I finished the rest of the book. So it inspired me to finish.
No, that's tremendous. And, and even just the little, how Sam and Friends led into these relationships, and a 17-year-old Frank Oz. And, I go, Martin and Lewis and Nichols and May and Henson and Oz, like that's where my comedy finds are.
And I think, I was able to get the forward from him. I think part of what helped is that after I asked him, I started doing the research for the book, and then, a month after I took my main research trip down to DC, I had a quadruple bypass operation.
Oh.
And, I let Frank know, oh, and by the way, don't worry, there's plenty of time about the forward because I have to go in the hospital next week and I have a quadruple bypass. And he writes back, what's happening? And it's like, he calls, he's like, you gotta have Stephanie call me. It's like, and he called me when I got home, and then, he was, I think then he's like, well, now I have to write this. He's, had tubes sticking out of his body.
It's the hardest sell he's ever gotten. Yeah.
In the opening pages of the book, you hope that this release will help inspire creatives, because we talk about Jim Henson knew nothing about puppeteering, and look what happened. What are some of the, maybe the nuancy things, the little things that we haven't talked about yet that you really love about Sam and Friends as a whole that you think is part of that inspiration?
Well, I think that just the fact that it had a lot of rough edges. And that's, people think of Jim Henson, certainly in the later years, as being incredible attention to detail. And for several years, and you go back and look at the clippings, Jim used to downplay the Sam and Friends era. There was a period of time where he would say, oh, my first puppets weren't very good. Or, I had, it was a little show in DC, my wife and I did, and, it wasn't great, but, we didn't get paid a lot. And then I think over time, he sort of saw the importance of what it meant in the development of the Muppets. So he didn't quite, downplay it as much as he did. There was a period of time, I think, when the Muppet Show was on, when he was sort of saying, oh, the puppets weren't that great. But Jane talked about this a lot, where it was that Sam and Friends was, she said, purposely devised to have rough edges, so it looks like it's just thrown together, because it lets you just sort of take more liberties and not have to have everything, finished, and right. Where later on the Henson workshop, all the puppets had pants that have finished cuffs, even if they didn't have legs, but I think that it lets you take chances creatively, that it lets you, they would, if they did a show one day and it didn't work, they just wouldn't do it again, or they would try and fix it. You had opportunities to fail and to develop your art. And I think that that's an important lesson for young creative people to learn from this, is that you take chances, you do what you can. And now where, Jim Henson wanted to work in television. He built puppets to work in television. Right. And because in order to get to work in television at that period of time in 1955, you had to work for a television station. Mm-hmm. because that's the only place that had cameras. That's the only way to reach out to an audience.
Right.
Now people have a television studio in their pockets. You can, shoot on your phone. You can send it up to YouTube and reach an audience.
Right.
Yeah.
So, I think that one of the things I want to try and get readers to see is that if Jim Henson could do this in 1955 with limited technology and accomplish what he accomplished, you got no excuse. Where are all the Jim Hensons now?
Yeah.
It's really an inspirational story. I find that it's, you can just make stuff. I mean, Jim made Kermit from his mother's coat and a ping pong ball. And now Kermit is probably still the most identifiable puppet in the world. And it's just an amazing story. And I think it's really inspiring.
And to your point with everyone having a studio in their pocket, I think there's so many people that put so much pressure on themselves to go, oh, well, I can start this YouTube or this TikTok or whatever it is, but it has to be perfect because it has to be perfect so I get followers. Where you saw Jim Henson go through things and he did make mistakes and he did learn from things and he did change things over time. And I think how social media is today with the instant gratification, people need to remember that you can still make mistakes, and that's the best way to learn and grow and be more creative, is to make those mistakes and see it and do it that way instead of, oh, I have to make this perfect and get the followers. and
just make things for the sake of making it.
Yes.
My wife and I both went to Northwestern University. We weren't there at the same time because I'm so much older than she is. I'm 5 years older. But we both lived in the same dorm, which was the Communications Residential College. And we had, it was a period of time where we did not have studios in our pockets yet. So we had equipment in the dorm. There were video cameras and there was a photographic darkroom and video editing and audio production studio. And in addition to the projects that we would make for class, we just made projects that we wanted to make. We wanted to create just to create. We had access to the stuff. We had all of our neighbors in the dorm to be talent. And, so it was not uncommon for, someone to knock on your door and say, hey, you got an hour? I want to make a video, or I want to make a little short film. And, we would have, that's when we were making short films on Super 8 millimeter, and bringing it into the photo lab in Evanston to process. So it's, there's a lot to be said for just making stuff. And not thinking about if what people are going to see, if anybody sees it, and what people are going to think. Just make it.
Yes.
No, and that's what I really, I'm so glad you shared a copy with us, just to really see those elements of it. Because, you're thinking you're going to get a television, and I love that, television history book or what have you of a program, but really to add the creative element and the history and even the development of the relationship between Jim and Jane. And it's so fully rounded. That's what I really loved about the book, and I'm excited that it's finally here.
I'm so happy that you liked it, and one of the things that I started thinking about when I finished the book is you mentioned before that I talk about this as the period of Jim's unfiltered work, and I started realizing that I spent my career in television primarily, and working in some live venues as well, but mostly television, where I did not have the final word. I'd write a script, or get rewritten, and it would get, sometimes and if I was working on a Nickelodeon project, it would get tested and retested and edited and changed. And there were other people who had input, and the performers would, ad lib occasionally. And so by the time the finished product was on television, it was, I still felt proud of it most of the time, but it was not my singular product, and so it was very similar to the Jim situation, that this book, I wrote it, and with the help of my sister-in-law, who did a lot of the copy editing work on it, and the people at Bear Manor, but essentially what I wrote gets out into the audience. So there's there's a little bit of a similarity in that situation, that I feel a more direct contact with the reader than a lot of the other projects I've worked on.
Yeah.
And so on September 24th, you could have a big release party at the Museum of Moving.
Yes, everybody come.
Image. Everyone come. It's 7 blocks from my home. So I know that you have a whole afternoon planned there. If you can tell a little about that as well.
Yeah. What we're going to do is I'm compiling a collection of Sam and Friends clips, as well as Wilkins coffee commercials that have been beautifully scanned in high definition. The Sam and Friends clips have been scanned in high definition too, but there's only so much you can do to kinescopes to make them look better. And then Barbara Miller is going from the museum. She's the deputy director of the museum, and she's going to interview me about the book. I will also show, in addition to the main compilation, there's an episode of Sam and Friends that has been uncovered very recently when I was finishing work on this book, because it was not listed in the Henson database as a Sam and Friends, even though, in the research, and that's where it started. That's where it was first aired. So we were able to, pull it out of storage and get it transferred. So we'll be seen for the first time in 60 plus years at that event. And then we're going to give everybody, I'll show you, everybody will get this, everybody will get a gift, a couple of gifts, I think. But one of them will be the official Sam and Friends bookmark.
Nice.
Which is Professor Radcliffe's manual marking machine for books. And then I'll be signing books, assuming and hoping that they arrive in time. They're at the printers now, and hopefully we'll get them. We still have a few weeks, so we're hoping to get them in time.
Very cool.
That's fantastic. That's on Saturday, September 24th.
At 1 p.m.
At 1 p.m. Thank you very much for that. The tickets are online at the Museum of the Moving Images. I love the Museum of the Moving Image, because the Jim Henson exhibition is definitely the highlight for me, but there's so much little nuancey. You can go there multiple times and discover new elements of the history of television. I really love it.
And later this year, the Museum of American History down at the Smithsonian is going to be opening a new pop culture wing, and Sam and Friends will be featured.
Very cool.
In that permanent wing. It's interesting that they have this amazing collection of pop culture items, but they've never had a permanent area to devote to it, and they sort of they've displayed things from time to time in open spaces and in corridors where they have there's like an atrium where they would put out Archie Bunker's chair or Alphonse's jacket or Ruby Slippers, but this is going to be sort of like a pop culture temple of immense proportions. And cool. So the Sam and Friends puppets will be there, and we got to see when we paid a visit on my research trip to the museum. They took us into the archives, and they opened up the cabinets to show us the Sam and Friends characters. And it's wonderful because they sit next to a bunch of other Henson characters. And then, in the next cabinet over, there's Charlie McCarthy from Edgar Bergen, and there's Mr. Moose from Captain Kangaroo. And in the drawers underneath, it's Hawkeye's bathrobe, and it's Hawkeye's Hawaiian shirt, and Klinger's, Cleopatra dress.
Oh my!
And it's just, I was just going crazy because I was like, oh my God, it's Bob Barker's microphone.
Yeah.
One of the original Wheel of Fortune letters was sitting on a shelf. I mean, it's just amazing down there. You go crazy. I think December is they're talking about doing that. I'm hoping that we'll be able to go down there and do an event in DC.
Yeah,
that'd be really cool.
Yeah.
That's great. We didn't really touch on the fact that Sam and Friends was an introduction to Kermit, not then a frog. But I know that as we drop this episode on September 8th, you will be out at D23 doing a little Muppet something. I thought maybe you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, if you have tickets to D23, our event is actually on the 10th, on Saturday. I'll be heading out on the 8th. But this D23 is I'm sure a lot of your listeners know, is the official Disney fan convention. It's sold out, but if you're planning to go already and you have tickets, I would strongly suggest you go to the Muppet Christmas Carol 30th anniversary event on Saturday. I think it's at 1:00. And there are going to be a lot of fun things. You'll see Muppets in person. You'll see creative people behind the movie and some other surprises. And there'll be there'll be an announcement made. I can't say what it is, but it's going to be a lot of fun. It was sort of the D23 people approached me to produce this, and it was it was a really fun experience because I got to work with I always love working with performers and everybody. And Jim Lewis, who's a longtime staff writer that I used to work with at the Henson Company, he's been for many years sort of the primary, writer of material like this for Disney Muppets. So we got to work together one more time on doing some material for this.
There is such a strong fan base for the Muppets Christmas Carol. Like this is like things that we've learned over the podcast time. People on the Disney side love Hercules, and Hercules is kind of on the tail end of that Disney Renaissance. And I think maybe for me, post Jim Henson's death, so I didn't respond as well, I think, personally, to the Muppet Christmas Carol. But there is such a rich fan base for that movie that just love the Muppets Christmas Carol.
Yeah, and it's a movie, I think, that stands up really well over time because it's already, a classic, setting. If you watch, the early Muppet movies, which I love, especially the Muppet movie, that is sort of a snapshot of a period of the 1970s from, everything from guest stars to the everything that's in it. While Muppet Christmas Carol is a timeless look, and it's a very faithful telling of the story, and I think people respond to that. I saw they did a piece about A Christmas Carol on CBS Sunday Morning, and they asked a couple of historians. One was the archivist of the Dickens house in the UK, and a tour guide. They asked a tour guide who does a lot of Dickens tours in England what the most faithful adaptation of A Christmas Carol was, and they said it was the Muppets because Jerry Jewell took a lot of the material out of the book, and Paul Williams did too. He worked with a lot of the original content, and I think Brian Henson did a beautiful job directing it, which was a tough thing. It's all shot on sound stages. It's and it was one of these things where it was not a very high budget movie, and it was the first film shot not only after Jim Henson's death, but Richard Hunt as well.
You're right.
And it was, I think it just stands up really well. And I can't believe it's 30 years because when I was a young lad working at the Henson Company, I remember they had 2 table reads of the movie in New York City. And one after the other. The first one was almost like a rehearsal for the second one, because the first one, Michael Caine had not yet arrived, and some of the puppeteers had not yet arrived. So they asked Joe Henderson, who was then our receptionist, is now one of the VPs of Henson in LA. They asked Joe Henderson, who was also a part-time actor, to read Scrooge, and they asked me to read the other Muppets that weren't arrived yet. So, and so that was the first time that I really read through the script, and I said, "Oh, this is pretty cool." And then the next day, they had the full table read with Michael Caine and with the rest of the Muppets. And my reward for doing the first day was being able to sit in for the second day.
That's so cool.
And you could tell even from that table read that it was going to work, and it was going to be a really, really nice movie.
Well, and talked about in Sam and Friends, and then you see the through line to the Muppet Show, but you could argue and probably correctly that Michael Caine's interaction with the Muppets in that movie is the greatest human Muppet interaction.
Well, he played it so straight,
Mm-hmm.
he did not treat the Muppets any differently than he would treat an actor in a Shakespearean production. And that's what makes it work. He is handling the whole movie dead serious. There's no winks. There's no, there are no nudges to camera or anything. It's just he's in that world, and that makes that work. Because the Muppets are enough fun for everything else. It's like you need Scrooge to just be completely serious.
Yeah.
Well, this hour has flown by, so I can't believe it. Sam and Friends, the story of Jim Henson's first television show, is available for pre-order now, right through the publisher. I think you can do the Amazon thing, but the publisher is...
Yes, Bear Manor Media, bearmanormedia.com. You can also reach us on our website, samandfriendsbook.com, and we're on Twitter. I think it's Sam and Friends Book or Sam Friends Book, but basically just look us around. We're on Twitter, we're on Instagram, we're on Facebook. We're not on TikTok because I don't know how. But if you go to samandfriendsbook.com, it has links to everything else, and it also has some of the history of how the book was put together, some fun pictures, and we're adding some other material soon. Where we're going to have a little secret color photo gallery, because some of the photos in the book are originally in color, but in the book in black and white. So we're going to try and figure out if you have the book, and you could send an email to our website and hopefully get a password where you can see some of the pictures in color.
Very cool.
That'll happen a little bit after the book comes out.
Well, Jen and I are hoping to be there on the 24th. We're trying to put it all together now.
Oh, I hope you're both there.
So that would be cool.
Yes.
We're really excited for that.
We'll give you an extra bookmark.
Ooh, yes.
Hey.
Have I mentioned bearmanormedia.com? It's available. I also want to point out it's in hardcover, it's in softcover. There will be an ebook soon.
Nice.
Okay.
And
Awesome.
Amazon, you can get it on Amazon. You can, and think a Kindle on Amazon will be available on early October.
No excuse. You got all the things. There's no excuse. Yeah.
But I buy the physical book because it's just something really cool about a book.
Well, especially this kind. When we're talking about this kind of history, I think it's always a good resource for if you're a creative type, especially.
And I do want to just give a special shout out to Karen Falk, the Henson archivist. She did an amazing job working on all of the archival elements of this book, her and her whole team. And it became very challenging because a lot of this work had to be done remotely once the pandemic hit. So Karen was scanning an enormous volume of material because I was not allowed to come into the Henson archives during that period. I did some of the work in the archives before the pandemic, and then everything else had to go remote. But Karen did an amazing job, and all of her team, Carla and Susie and everybody. But get the book, read the acknowledgments in the back, and you'll see all of the people who, everybody, it's a labor of love, because the Henson Company was very generous in allowing me to write this book. They didn't charge for the use of the images, and Disney was kind enough, because Disney owns Kermit. They had to grant permission for Kermit to appear in the book, and they were kind enough to let me use Kermit without any fee. There were a lot of really kind people who helped make this book happen, and they all did it because they believed in the story of Jim Henson and Jane Henson and what we were trying to tell. And I think it means a lot to me, because Jane has, for many years, just resisted any praise. And as I say in the dedication, she's going to get her share of credit in this book, and there's nothing she can do about it. I think, for many years, she just thought that it was a clearer narrative if Jim was presented as the creator of the Muppets.
Yeah.
And, I just want to help set the record straight and convey how much Jane had to do with it.
The whole book is really fantastic. And again, ParaManorMedia.com.
Yes.
And
thanks
Shemin.
to all of the Henson family members too. We're very supportive.
Craig, thanks so much for the time, and just to talk about this is just tremendous.
I had a great time. I really did. We could keep it going. I'll come back again.
Yes,
but
please do.
I hope to see you both on September 24th.
Yeah, definitely.
We're going to try to make that happen. Craig, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Go to dillosdiz.com for blogs, vlogs, and more. dillosdiz.com. Follow Dillo's Diz on Twitter, on Instagram, and on TikTok at dillosdiz. Dillos with an S, Diz with the Z. You can like Dillo's Diz on Facebook, facebook.com/Dillo's Diz, and you can subscribe to Dillo's Diz on YouTube, youtube.com/Dillo's Diz. Then head over to DillosDizResort.com, your escape to Disney nostalgia. DillosDizResort.com, Patreon membership levels beginning as low as $1 per month. DillosDizResort.com. Theme Park Thursday with Dillo's Diz, featuring Frank Cardillo and Jen Cardillo Snyder. The theme was composed by Matt Harvey. The intro and the outro was performed by Lindsay Zerugian. The Dillo's Diz fact checker is Mel Dale. Until next week, we'll see you real soon for Theme Park Thursday with Dillo's Diz. The Improviser's Guide Network 2022.